Is this truly the best you can send me? The voice sliced through the radio. Cold, amused, merciless. A black jet materialized from nowhere, already locked on. I have a missile lock, Captain. I could end you right now. Silence answered him. Not fear. Something colder. Somewhere below, an old colonel froze over a file of black ink, whispering a name unheard in 9 years. Because the woman climbing alone into that sky wasn't just defending a border. She was walking straight toward the one man alive who knew the truth about her father's death. The enemy ace laughed, certain he already owned this fight. He had no idea the silent pilot in his crosshairs had once vanished from radar entirely, dismantling 4 aircraft without saying a single word. He was about to learn her name the hard way, and by then it would already be too late to run. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, military units, call signs, and events are entirely invented and do not depict real individuals, real operations, or real organizations. The wind came first, before the engines, before the sirens, before any of it. It came sweeping low across the high desert floor of Talon Ridge Air Force Base, dragging grit and heat across 2 miles of sun-bleached tarmac, rattling the loose bolts on a maintenance hangar door that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Somewhere past the flight line, a windsock snapped taut and held there, stiff, pointing east, like it already knew something was coming. Captain Delaney Marsh stood at the edge of the runway apron with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a folder of transfer orders tucked under her arm, and she did not move when the wind hit her, did not flinch, did not brush the hair out of her face. She just let it happen. Let the grit sting her cheek. Let the heat press against her like a hand on her chest. Because that was the thing about Delaney Marsh that people never understood right away. She didn't fight the things that came at her. She waited them out. 29 years old, 5'7", sandy brown hair pulled back so tight it looked painted on. Gray-blue eyes that gave away exactly nothing, which was either the most unsettling thing about her or the most impressive, depending on who you asked. And nobody at Talon Ridge had asked her anything yet, because she'd landed 40 minutes ago, taxied to the visiting aircraft ramp, climbed down from the transport without a word to the loadmaster. And now here she was, standing alone on the edge of a base that didn't know her name yet. It would. Soon enough it would. She let her eyes move across the base the way she always did on arrival. Cataloging. Not out of nerves. Out of habit. The same habit that had kept her alive more than once. Though nobody here knew that yet either. 2 runways, crossed in a shallow X, a control tower, catching the morning light in flat silver panes. Rows of hardened aircraft shelters lined up like teeth along the northern taxiway, and beyond them, low buildings the color of sand, baking under a sky scrubbed almost white by heat. Home. For now. It never lasted long enough to be anything else. A truck rolled up beside her, tires crunching over loose gravel, and a young airman leaned out the window with a clipboard pressed to the door. Captain Marsh? Yes. One word, flat, final. The airman waited half a second for something more, a joke, a complaint about the heat, anything, and when nothing came, he just nodded and jerked his thumb toward the passenger seat. Colonel Whitlock wants you in his office ASAP. She climbed in. Didn't ask why. Didn't need to. She already knew. Every base she'd ever transferred to, there was always a version of this moment. The summons. The look. The careful, cautious tone that people used when they'd read a personnel file that was mostly black ink and blank space. And they didn't know what to make of the woman sitting across from them. She'd learned to expect it. Learned to sit through it. Which didn't mean she'd learned to like it. The airman drove in silence for a while, glancing at her sideways twice, the way people always did when they were trying to decide whether the rumors traveling ahead of a person could possibly be true. She didn't give him anything to work with, just watched the base slide past the window, a fuel truck idling near a hangar, 2 mechanics laughing over an open panel on an F-16's intake, a faded sign reading, "Welcome to Talon Ridge," home of the 91st Fighter Squadron, the Widowmakers. The paint on the eagle mascot peeling at the wingtip. Home of the Widowmakers. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Every squadron picked a name meant to sound fearsome. And every squadron eventually discovered that the name meant nothing at all, until the people wearing the patch decided what it meant. She wondered briefly what they'd decide about her. She already had a guess. She was usually right about those. Colonel Grant Whitlock's office smelled like old coffee and older paper. Faded photographs lined one wall, squadrons long since disbanded, jets long since retired, faces of men who were now gray-haired or gone. He sat behind a desk that had seen 3 decades of Air Force careers pass through it, and when Delaney stepped through the door, he didn't stand. He just looked at her, really looked, the way men who'd flown fighters for 30 years looked at things, reading airspeed and altitude off a face instead of a HUD. Captain Marsh. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. She sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He studied her the way a man studies weather he can't quite predict, searching for a pattern, a front, some early warning sign of what was coming. She let him look. She'd had a great deal of practice being looked at. I read your file this morning. He tapped a manila folder on his desk. Thick, heavy, and when he flipped it open, page after page slid into view, and page after page was black, redacted lines running like scars across the paper. Whole sections gone. Entire years blacked out. Most of it. Anyway, what's left to read? Yes, sir. You transferred from Fenwick Naval Air Station. Test and Evaluation Squadron. He turned a page. Another wall of black ink stared back at him. Before that, according to what little I can see here, you were attached to something called Task Force Solus, which doesn't exist. According to every database I have access to, Task Force Solus has never existed. Silence. He waited. She let him wait, because that was the only answer she had for him. Not evasion, not defiance. Just the plain fact that some doors didn't open because you knocked politely, and she'd learned a long time ago that filling silence with false reassurance only made people trust you less, not more. You don't talk much, do you, Captain? No, sir. Whitlock leaned back in his chair. The leather groaned under him. Outside his window, a pair of F-16s taxied past, engines whining low, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Just watched the jets roll by. 2 predators in gray paint waiting their turn to hunt. I'll be straight with you, Whitlock said finally. I don't like flying blind, and that's what this is. Somebody upstairs decided you belonged in my squadron, and they didn't see fit to tell me why. Which means, either you're the best pilot I've never heard of, he closed the folder, or you're a problem I haven't found yet. Delaney held his gaze. Didn't blink, didn't reach for an excuse. I fly by the book, Colonel. Everybody says that until the book stops working. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The corner of her mouth twitched, and then it was gone, tucked back behind the same still expression she wore into every room. Whitlock caught it anyway, filed it away. A man who'd been reading pilots for 30 years didn't miss things like that. Let me tell you what I know, Whitlock said, since apparently that's the only side of this conversation anyone's willing to have. I know your check rides are flawless. I know your simulator scores are the highest this wing has logged in 6 years. I know somebody in a building with no address decided you needed a quiet assignment, far from anything that resembles a spotlight, and I know that whoever made that decision didn't ask me whether I wanted a pilot I can't fully vouch for. I understand the position that puts you in, sir, do you? He wasn't asking, because from where I sit, Captain, it puts me in the position of trusting a stranger with my squadron's lives, on the word of people who won't return my calls. I've never gotten anyone killed, Colonel. That's not the same as telling me you won't. The words landed harder than either of them expected. Delaney felt something tighten behind her ribs, not anger. Exactly. Something closer to the old, familiar ache of being measured before she'd had the chance to prove anything at all. She'd carried that ache from base to base for years now, and she'd stopped expecting it to get lighter. It never did. Report to the 91st Fighter Squadron, Whitlock said, after a pause that lasted a beat too long. Captain Dax Kerwin runs the flight line day to day. He's a good pilot. Hot-headed. Doesn't like surprises. A pause. You're going to be a surprise, Captain Marsh. I hope you're ready for what that costs you around here. I've paid it before. Something in the way she said it made Whitlock go still, just for a second. Just long enough that she noticed. Because there'd been no bitterness in the sentence. No self-pity. Just fact. Delivered the way she delivered every fact, flat, level, closed. And it was precisely that flatness that unsettled him. A person complaining about cost sounded wounded. A person simply stating the cost, like a line item on an invoice already paid in full, sounded like something else entirely. Sounded like someone who'd survived something. "What exactly did you pay, Captain?" She didn't answer. Of course she didn't answer. Whitlock nodded slowly, more to himself than to her, and gestured toward the door, and the moment closed like a hatch sealing shut, and she stood, and she left, and neither of them said another word about it. But it stayed with him, long after she was gone. That sentence sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples didn't stop. I've paid it before. What did that mean? He didn't know yet. He would. He sat alone for a long while after she left, the redacted file still open on his desk, and found himself doing something he rarely did anymore after 30 years in uniform. He found himself worried about a pilot he'd known for exactly 9 minutes. He got up, walked to the window, watched the 2 F-16s he'd seen taxi past earlier, now lined up at the hold short line, waiting their turn on the runway, engines shimmering the air behind them. 31 years he'd worn this uniform. 31 years of reading pilots the way other men read stock tickers or box scores. And in all that time, he could count on one hand the number who'd unsettled him inside of 10 minutes. Delaney Marsh had been one of them, decades ago, back when Whitlock was young enough to still be impressed by legends. He remembered meeting the man exactly once, at a joint exercise long since forgotten by everyone. Except the handful of officers who'd been there remembered a quiet, unassuming pilot who let his flying do all the talking a room ever needed, remembered thinking, even then, that there was something almost unsettling about a man that good who never once raised his voice to prove it. He hadn't made the connection until just now. Marsh. He said the name out loud to the empty office, testing the shape of it, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He pulled the file back toward him, flipped to the cover page again, studied the small identifying details that hadn't been redacted: birth year, hometown, next of kin left blank, which was itself strange, because next of kin was never left blank on an active service record, unless somebody had gone out of their way to make sure it stayed that way. Somebody had gone out of their way with this entire file. That much was obvious even from what little he could see. He closed it, sat back down, and made a note in his own private log, the one he kept separate from official channels, the one that existed mostly so an old man could keep his own thoughts straight when the official record insisted on staying so carefully, deliberately blank. Captain D. Marsh. Possible connection: Colonel N. Marsh. Deceased. Confirm before drawing conclusions. Watch closely. He underlined the last 2 words twice. She walked the flight line alone on her way to find the squadron building, because nobody had offered to walk her there, and because she preferred it that way regardless. The heat had climbed since her arrival. Somewhere past 10 in the morning now, the desert sun turning the tarmac into something that shimmered at the edges, blurring the hardened shelters into wavering gray shapes in the distance. She passed a maintenance crew working on an intake cowling, one of them glancing up at her with open curiosity, before a supervisor barked something and sent eyes back to work. She passed a young airman wheeling a cart of avionics equipment who nodded at her, uncertain, the way people nodded at someone they'd already heard rumors about but hadn't yet decided whether to believe. Word traveled fast on a base this size. It always did. By the time she found the low, sand-colored building marked 91st Fighter Squadron, the Widowmakers, she suspected every person inside already knew 3 different half-true stories about her, and she suspected none of them would be the story that actually mattered. She was right about that, too. She pushed open the door and stepped into air conditioning that hit her like a wall, cold enough to raise gooseflesh along her arms after the desert heat outside. and the low hum of conversation in the ready room dropped by half the moment the door swung shut behind her. Not all the way. Just enough that she knew everyone had heard her come in. The squadron ready room at Talon Ridge smelled like jet fuel and stale energy drinks. Mission planning maps taped along one wall, a chalkboard in the corner, still bearing the ghost of yesterday's sortie schedule half erased. When Delaney walked through the door with her flight bag over one shoulder, 6 heads turned at once. Then 5 of them turned back to what they were doing. One didn't. Captain Dax Kerwan sat sideways in a folding chair near the coffee machine, boots up on a second chair, a patch on his flight suit that read Titan in bold silver stitching. Broad shoulders, jaw like a cinder block. The kind of pilot who filled a room the second he walked into it because he made sure to. And right now his eyes were locked on Delaney like she'd wandered in off the wrong movie set. "You're the transfer," he said. Not a question. "Yes, Marsh." He said her name like he was tasting it, testing it for weakness. "That mean anything to anybody?" Nobody answered. A young lieutenant near the window, sandy-haired, easygoing smile, name patch reading. Lund glanced up from his coffee with the wary interest of a man watching 2 storm fronts about to collide. Near the map table, a stocky maintenance officer. Everyone called Petrosky pretended very hard to be reading a clipboard he wasn't actually reading. Kerwan swung his boots down off the chair. Stood, 6'2" of pure certainty, walking a slow circle around her like he was inspecting a used car. "Word is your files got more black ink than white paper," he said. "Word is nobody upstairs will say where you came from. Word is..." He stopped in front of her. Close. Testing whether she'd step back. She didn't. "You don't talk on the radio. I talk when there's something worth saying." Somewhere behind him, Lund made a small sound that might have been a laugh he swallowed halfway. Kerwan's jaw tightened. "Up there," he said, jabbing a finger toward the ceiling, toward the sky beyond it. "Silence gets people killed. You understand that? I don't care what black budget program built you. Up there, I need to hear my wingman. I need calls. I need a voice in my ear telling me where the threat is. Because a blip on a radar screen doesn't talk back, and neither, apparently, do you." "I clicked twice," Delaney said. Acknowledged. "That's not a call sign. That's a nervous tick. It's efficient. It's creepy." And there it was. The word landed in the room like a dropped wrench, and for one beat nobody moved, and Delaney felt something old and familiar settle over her shoulders. A weight she'd worn into a dozen ready rooms before this one. She'd been called worse. She'd survived being called creepy by a man whose ego took up more oxygen than the HVAC system could replace. "Understood," she said, flat, even, giving him nothing, which somehow made it worse for him. She could see it happen, the way his frustration climbed a notch, because she wasn't rattled, because she wasn't defending herself, because she was simply absorbing the insult and setting it down somewhere he couldn't see.
"You know what happened to the last quiet pilot who transferred through here?"
Kerwan pressed. Kept things close to the chest. Didn't share intel with the flight lead until it was too late to matter. "Guy's flying a desk in Alaska now. Is that a threat, Captain? It's a fact. Then it's a fact about him, not about me." Kerwan's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected that the flatness of it, the refusal to bend even an inch under pressure that would have folded most first-day transfers by now. Around the room, a few of the other pilots had stopped even pretending to look busy, watching the exchange with a particular hunger people reserved for the first real conflict of a new arrival's tenure. "Fine," Kerwan said, backing off half a step, though the challenge in his voice hadn't fully cooled. "We'll see how efficient your clicking is the first time somebody's shooting at you for real." "You will," Delaney said. Not a threat, not bravado, just a plain, quiet certainty that landed somehow heavier than anything he'd said to her yet, and Kerwan opened his mouth to answer and then, for reasons he couldn't have explained even to himself, closed it again, because there'd been something underneath the sentence. Something that didn't belong to a nervous first-day transfer trying to hold her ground. Something closer to a woman who'd already stood in that exact fire before, more than once, and had simply outlasted it every time. He didn't know what to do with that. So he did what men like Kerwan usually did, when they didn't know what to do with something. He pushed harder. "You think you're the first hotshot with a sealed file to walk through that door?" he said. "I've seen 3 of you rotate through this squadron in 5 years. Every single one showed up quiet and confident, just like you. Every single one folded the first time things got loud. Then I suppose you'll finally get to see what happens when one doesn't." The room had gone almost entirely silent now, every pilot pretending to study a map or a checklist, while actually tracking the exchange out of the corner of one eye. Even Petrosky had abandoned all pretense of reading his clipboard. Kirwan's eyes narrowed a fraction further. He turned away first. Which he'd remember later, which would eat at him later, in ways he couldn't yet name. "Whatever," Kirwan muttered, dropping back into his chair. "Just don't get me killed with your silent treatment routine, Marsh. That's all I'm asking." Delaney set her bag down by an empty locker at the back of the room. Metal door. No nameplate yet. She'd have to requisition one. She always did. Every base, every squadron, every empty locker with somebody else's ghost still rattling around inside it. She ran her hand once along the cold metal door, feeling the small dent near the hinge where some previous occupant had slammed it once in frustration or grief or both, and thought, not for the first time, that squadron lockers carried more history than any personnel file ever could. Nobody redacted a dent. Lieutenant Sawyer Lund found her 20 minutes later at the flight planning table, hunched over a laminated map of the local training airspace with a highlighter in one hand. "Hey," he dropped into the chair across from her, uninvited, coffee in hand. "Don't mind Kirwan. He's not actually an animal. Most days. I don't mind him." "You sure?" "Because most people mind him. He's not wrong to be careful." Lund blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "That's a generous read on somebody who just called you creepy to your face." "He's not wrong that silence unsettles people," Delaney said, not looking up from the map. "He's wrong about why I use it. Those are different problems." Lund considered that for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "Okay," he said. "I'll bite. Why do you use it?" She didn't answer. Of course she didn't answer. Lund laughed not unkindly, more like a man recognizing a pattern he found amusing rather than frustrating. "Right. Should have seen that coming." She didn't answer. Just kept tracing a highlighter line along a restricted corridor on the map, the one that ran east toward the Ashcombe exclusion zone, the one every pilot on this base had been briefed to avoid without express clearance. Lund studied her for a second. Curious. Not hostile, genuinely curious, in the way of a young pilot who hadn't yet learned that curiosity could get you burned. "So what's the deal?" he said, "with the file, the black ink? Everybody's got a theory. What's yours?" "Mine's boring. I think you did something classified nobody's cleared to know about, and the Pentagon just parks you wherever there's a gap in the roster." He shrugged. "Kirwan thinks you're a spy. Petrosky in maintenance thinks you're some kind of psychological experiment. Personally, I just think—" He stopped himself, which was interesting. Delaney glanced up from the map for the first time since he'd sat down. "You think what?" "I think you're carrying something," Lund said, quieter now. "I don't know what, but I've seen guys come back from deployments carrying things. You've got that look. The look where somebody's already used up all they're scared, so there's nothing left to spend." Delaney went still, because he wasn't wrong, because nobody had said it out loud to her before. Not like that. Not with that particular gentleness that made it worse, somehow, than Kirwan's contempt. Which was the trouble with kindness. Hostility she knew how to carry. Hostility had rules, edges, a shape she could brace against. Kindness slipped past the bracing entirely and found the soft someplace underneath before she'd even seen it coming. "You should get back to your coffee, Lieutenant," she said. Not unkind, just closed. A door swinging shut, quiet on its hinges. Lund held up both hands in mock surrender and stood, and as he walked away, he glanced back once, just once, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not suspicion. Something closer to worry. He paused at the edge of the table. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've got half a sandwich with your name on it at lunch. No pressure. It'll just be sitting there, being a sandwich." "I don't need your sandwich, Lieutenant." Never said you needed it, Lund said, already walking away. Said it'd be there. She watched him go, something faint and unfamiliar tugging at the corner of her composure, and told herself it didn't matter. Told herself it was noise. A distraction from the only thing that had ever mattered to her in a new squadron: do the job, fly the jet, survive the silence, until it stopped being a question mark hanging over every room she walked into. She almost believed herself. Her quarters that first afternoon were small, spare, the same as every other set of visiting officers' quarters she'd unpacked in over the last 9 years. A bed, a desk, a narrow closet, a window that looked out onto a stretch of gravel, and, past it, the perimeter fence, catching the last hard light of the day. She unpacked the way she did everything. In order, in silence. Uniforms hung first, spaced evenly, sleeves aligned. Boots set beneath them, toes facing out, laces tucked. A small stack of paperback novels arranged on the desk by height rather than title, because height was easier to keep tidy, and she'd never much cared what order she read them in anyway. And last, always last, because it mattered too much to rush, she unwrapped the photograph from the soft cloth she carried it in and set it on the nightstand, angled just slightly toward the bed, the way she'd angled it in a dozen rooms before this one. She stood there a moment, looking at it. 9 years, and the ritual hadn't changed. 9 years, and she still unpacked her father before she unpacked herself, as if the room wasn't fully hers until he'd been given his place in it first. She sat on the edge of the bed, let the silence of the room settle around her the way it always did in the first hours of a new posting. Not lonely, exactly. She'd stopped calling it lonely years ago, because lonely implied an absence of something she'd once had and missed. And this felt more like a steady state, a baseline she'd built her whole adult life around maintaining. Still, there were nights the baseline felt heavier than others. Tonight was one of them. She thought of Kirwan's voice creepy and told herself it didn't matter, and mostly believed it. She thought of Lund's easy grin, the sandwich he'd probably already forgotten offering, and something in her chest loosened by a fraction she didn't examine too closely. She thought of Whitlock's question, the one he hadn't quite asked, but she'd heard anyway, hovering somewhere underneath everything he had asked. "What exactly did you pay, Captain?" She didn't have an answer that fit in a sentence. She wasn't sure she had an answer that fit in a lifetime. That night she sat alone in the visiting officer's quarters, with a paperback novel open on her lap, and didn't read a single word of it. Her father's photograph sat on the nightstand where it always sat. Every base, every room. A man in an old flight suit, laughing at something outside the frame, squinting into a sun that had set 9 years ago and never quite risen again. Colonel Nathaniel Marsh. Legend was the word people used, back when they still said his name out loud. Test pilot. Instructor. The kind of aviator other aviators measured themselves against and came up short. He'd flown things that never made it into public inventories, tested envelopes that weren't supposed to exist yet, and every young pilot on every base he'd ever touched had a story about the time Colonel Marsh saved their life with a maneuver that shouldn't have worked. She picked up the photograph, studied it the way she studied it most nights, though she could have drawn every line of his face from memory by now. The crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the small scar above one eyebrow he'd never fully explained, the flight suit patch worn soft and pale from a decade of washing. He'd taught her to fly before she was old enough to legally drive a car. Small aircraft at first, on quiet airstrips far from any base, just the two of them and a headset too big for her ears, and his voice, patient, endlessly patient, walking her through crosswind landings until she stopped white-knuckling the yoke. Fly the airplane. D. Don't let the airplane fly you. She could still hear him say it. 9 years later, and she could still hear the exact cadence of his voice, low and unhurried, the way he'd said her name like it was the most natural word in the English language. And then, 9 years ago, on a training flight over a stretch of restricted airspace nobody talked about anymore, his aircraft had gone down. Mechanical failure, the report said. Pilot error, the whisper said, when they thought she wasn't listening. And Delaney, 20 years old that year, deep into her own flight training. Still learning to solo, had sat through a funeral with a flag folded into a tight triangle pressed into her hands, and had listened to a base commander she'd never met before or since say words like tragic accident and devoted to services in a voice that didn't quite meet her eyes. She remembered the reception afterward. The stiff-backed officers in dress uniforms making small talk near the punch bowl. The careful way people had looked at her and her mother. The particular kind of pity that comes dressed up as respect. She remembered stepping out onto a balcony for air and hearing two voices through an open window below her. Hushed, urgent, cut off the second they realized someone might hear. She'd frozen there. 20 years old, black dress still smelling faintly of the dry cleaning bag, listening to a conversation she was never meant to hear. She's asking questions. Then somebody needs to tell her to stop. There are things about that flight that will never see daylight, and the longer she keeps digging, the more people she puts at risk. She'd never found out who said it. Never found out what questions her mother had been asking, exactly, because her mother had gone quiet about it not long after, and stayed quiet until the day she passed, 5 years later, without ever explaining why. Delaney had learned in the years since to stop asking too. Out loud anyway. Because asking out loud had never once made anything better. Because every time she'd tried a records request here, a phone call there, always careful, always cautious, the answers had come back thinner than the questions she'd sent out, or hadn't come back at all. Because eventually, a person learned that some doors weren't locked so much as they simply didn't exist anymore, sealed over so completely that knocking only bruised your knuckles, so she'd stopped knocking. She'd built a life instead, a career, a discipline so total it left no room for the questions to breathe. And if anyone ever asked her why she flew, the way she flew, silent, precise, utterly controlled, she never told them the truth. The truth was that silence had never been a strategy. It had been a splint, something wrapped tight around a break that had never properly healed, holding the pieces together well enough to function, if not well enough to ever really mend. She set the photograph down, closed the paperback, and in the dark, before sleep took her, she did what she always did. She listened to the wind against the window, the distant grind of a maintenance truck somewhere on the flight line, the low hum of a base that never really slept. Listening had always come easier to her than talking. It was the only language that had never lied to her. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, the way days on a new base always did. Dawn briefings in a room that smelled like burnt coffee. Training sorties over the high desert, 4-ship formations carving contrails against a sky the color of gunmetal. Debriefs where Kerwin critiqued everyone's flying except his own, and everyone let him. Because arguing with Titan took more energy than it was worth, and through all of it Delaney flew exactly the way she always flew. Precisely, silently, devastatingly well. On her third training sortie, she put an entire simulated missile engagement into a box so tight the range officer had to review the tape twice to believe it. He called Whitlock personally that evening, and Whitlock listened without saying much and hung up the phone with the growing, uneasy sense that the file on his desk was underselling her by an order of magnitude. On her fifth sortie, she outturned Kirwan in a training dogfight so completely that he didn't speak to her for the rest of the day, not out of anger, this time, but out of something that looked, if you squinted, almost like respect, trying to find a place to land and not finding one yet. He came close to saying something to her in the locker room afterward. Stood near his own locker for a long moment, jaw working, clearly building up to a sentence he wasn't sure he wanted to say. "That last merge," he said finally. "The scissors you pulled. Where'd you learn that? Somewhere I can't talk about." "Of course you can't." He shook his head, not quite a laugh. "You know that answer's getting old, right?" "I know. You gonna give me a different one someday?" Delaney zipped her bag shut, looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Kerwin almost took a step back, though he'd never have admitted it. "Maybe," she said, "when there's a reason to." It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd given anyone at Talon Ridge so far, and Kerwan seemed to understand that, filing it away the same careful way Whitlock had filed away her sentence in his office. Something small, something that might eventually add up to something larger. She never celebrated a win, never explained a maneuver beyond the barest necessity. When the instructors asked how she'd pulled off a particular sequence, she'd say something short angle of attack or energy management, and leave the rest unsaid. The way she left almost everything unsaid, and the squadron slowly stopped expecting more from her than that. They started calling her the ghost. Not to her face. Never to her face. But she heard it anyway, the way she heard everything, filtering in through half-closed doors and lowered voices, and she let it settle over her without complaint. It wasn't the worst thing she'd been called. It wasn't even close. Sawyer Lund kept trying, in his own quiet way, sitting near her at the flight planning table, offering half a sandwich at lunch she never accepted, but he kept offering anyway, a small, ongoing ritual that had somehow become the closest thing to a routine friendship she'd allowed herself in years. Small, persistent kindnesses that she didn't know what to do with, because kindness had always been harder for her to hold on to than hostility. Hostility she understood. Hostility had rules. Kindness just made her feel exposed. On her fourth evening at Talon Ridge, the squadron gathered in the base dining facility for what Lund insisted on calling family dinner, though nothing about it resembled family so much as a room full of exhausted young officers arguing loudly over trays of overcooked chicken and instant mashed potatoes. Delaney took her tray to the end of a long table, alone the way she always did, and had almost made it through half a meal in peace when Lund dropped into the seat across from her without asking, a small parade of other pilots trailing behind him and claiming the rest of the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You can't eat alone forever," Lund announced, as if this were a scientific fact he'd personally verified. "It's against squadron bylaws." "There are no squadron bylaws. There are now. I just made one up. It's called the No Ghost Zone. You're in it." Across the table, a pilot named Reyes snorted into her tray. "He's been workshopping that one all week." "It's a good bit," Lund said, wounded. "I stand by the bit." Kerwan appeared a moment later, dropping his own tray down at the far end of the table with the particular heaviness of a man who'd had a long day and intended everyone to know it. He glanced at Delaney, glanced away. Then, almost against his own will, glanced back. "You put Dawes into an unrecoverable position in the simulator today," he said. "Twice in the same sortie. He's a good pilot." "He's a good pilot who left his flank open," Delaney said. "Those aren't contradictions." A ripple of laughter moved down the table, not at her. Exactly, more the surprised, delighted laughter of people discovering a joke where they hadn't expected to find one. Kerwan's jaw tightened for half a second before something almost like amusement won out over his pride. "Careful," he muttered. "Keep talking like that and people are going to forget you're supposed to be the quiet one." "I am the quiet one," Delaney said. "I'm just accurate about it." Even Lund laughed at that, nearly choking on a mouthful of potatoes. And for one unguarded moment, brief, unremarkable, gone almost as soon as it arrived, Delaney felt something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she wanted to admit, something close to belonging. It frightened her more than Kerwan's hostility ever had. Belonging meant investment. Investment meant loss, eventually, the way it always eventually meant loss, because bases changed and squadrons rotated, and people you let yourself care about had a way of becoming names on memorial walls or entries in files nobody was allowed to fully read. She finished her tray in near silence after that, letting the conversation wash over her without pulling her back in, and told herself the distance was safer. It usually was. Tonight, for reasons she couldn't quite name, it didn't feel like safety so much as a habit she was no longer entirely sure she wanted to keep. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling 4-ship training mission that had left half the squadron drenched in sweat and short-tempered, Lund found her sitting alone on the low wall outside the squadron building, staring at nothing in particular. "You ever gonna tell anybody your first name?" he asked, dropping down beside her, careful to leave space. "Because at this point I think half the squadron thinks Delaney's classified too." "It's on my flight suit." "Sure. In tiny letters nobody reads because they're too busy staring at the fact that you just made Titan look like a student pilot in a training scissors. Delaney's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, close enough that Lund noticed, and looked absurdly pleased with himself for causing it. "There it is," he said. "I've been keeping a tally, you know. That's twitch number 3 since you got here. I'm building a whole chart." "That's a waste of your time, Lieutenant. Everything I do is a waste of time. It's kind of my brand." He took a sip of his coffee, considering her sideways. "You know what I think, though? For real, not the joking version. I don't recall asking. I think you flew like that today, that clean, that controlled, because it's easier than the alternative. Easier to be perfect in the air than to be anything at all on the ground." He shrugged, not pushing, just laying the thought down gently and letting it sit there between them. "I could be wrong. Wouldn't be the first time." Delaney didn't answer. Didn't need to. Lund seemed to understand that too, standing after a moment, brushing dust off his flight suit. "Sandwich is in the fridge with your name on it if you change your mind." "I won't." "Yeah," he said, walking away, unbothered as always. "You keep saying that." Colonel Whitlock watched her from a distance, most days not intrusive, not obvious, just present, the way a man watches weather building on a horizon he can't yet name. He'd catch her sometimes in the alert shack between sorties, sitting alone with a paperback, and he'd nod, and she'd nod back, and neither of them said much, but he was building a file of his own. Not the classified kind, the human kind. The kind built out of small, observed things, the way she checked the horizon before she checked her instruments, the way her hands never shook, not once, not during the roughest turbulence, not during the one live fire exercise that had gone sideways and nearly clipped a range tower, the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, every single time someone mentioned Fenwick Naval Air Station in casual conversation, like the name itself carried a weight nobody else could see. He didn't know what it added up to, yet, but he knew it added up to something. He mentioned it once, carefully, to his executive officer over coffee. "There's a stillness to that Marsh girl," he said. "The kind you don't train into somebody. The kind that gets trained out of somebody, if you follow me." His executive officer hadn't followed him. Not really. But Whitlock hadn't expected him to. Some things a man only understood if he'd spent 30 years learning to read the small, quiet signs pilots left behind them like footprints in sand signs that told you more about where someone had been than any personnel file ever could. 6 days after Delaney Marsh arrived at Talon Ridge, the first Obsidian Group incursion of the week lit up the radar screens. It happened fast, the way these things always happened. A blip on the edge of the Ashcombe corridor, gone before anyone could get eyes on it, followed by a terse operations brief that used words like probing and pattern of life and escalation. Nobody at Talon Ridge had to be told what Obsidian Group was. Everybody knew. A private military contractor with no flag and no conscience, staffed by pilots who'd been discharged from half a dozen air forces around the world for the kind of conduct that couldn't be explained away, flying under contract for whoever paid the largest number with the fewest questions attached. Officially, Obsidian Group didn't exist. Officially, the aircraft that kept probing the restricted airspace along the Ashcombe corridor belonged to nobody. Unofficially, everybody at Talon Ridge had lost somebody, a friend, a squadron mate, a name on a memorial wall to the black-painted jets that came screaming out of nowhere and vanished just as fast. Whitlock called an all-hands briefing that evening. The ready room packed in tight, folding chairs scraped across linoleum, coffee cups clutched in tired hands. Delaney took her usual seat at the back, notebook open on her knee, pen moving in small, precise strokes as Whitlock ran through the week's activity. 3 incursions in the last 5 days, he said, tapping a laser pointer against a wall map. All along here. The red dot traced the Ashcombe corridor, a jagged line of restricted airspace running east through desert terrain that belonged, on paper, to nobody in particular. Command believes it's reconnaissance, testing our response times, mapping our patrol patterns. Reconnaissance for what? A lieutenant near the front asked. Whitlock's jaw tightened. That's the question nobody upstairs wants to answer directly. which tells me it's a question with an answer somebody doesn't want us to have. The room went quiet. Kirwan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And unofficially, sir, unofficially, Whitlock said, everybody in this room already knows the name I'm about to say, so I'll just say it. Damien Voss. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. The stories about him traveled faster than any official briefing ever could. A former pilot from an Allied Air Force, washed out years ago for conduct so reckless it had nearly gotten his own wingmen killed, resurfacing under Obsidian Group's banner, flying a modified Eurofighter, Typhoon painted the color of a starless night. 6 confirmed kills against coalition aircraft in the last 18 months. Maybe more that nobody had confirmed yet. He didn't just shoot pilots down. He toyed with them first. Broadcast his radar locks over open channels. Let terrified young aviators hear the tone that meant they were about to die, and then let them live with it a little longer before he decided whether to pull the trigger. Kirwan brought it up again after the briefing broke, jaw tight, voice hard, standing near the coffee machine with a fresh cup he wasn't actually drinking. Command thinks Voss is building up to something bigger than probing runs. Says he's been quiet the last week, which is worse, because Voss doesn't do quiet unless he's planning something loud. Nobody argued with that. Lund, leaning against the doorframe with his own untouched coffee, spoke up quieter than usual. I flew with a guy at my last posting. Bristow, good stick, steady hands. He turned his cup slowly, not quite looking at anyone. He went up against Voss 8 months ago, made it home. Barely. What happened to him? A younger lieutenant asked. Physically, nothing. Not a scratch. Lund's voice had lost its usual lightness entirely now. He just doesn't fly anymore. Put in for a ground assignment 3 weeks after. Said Voss, let him hear the lock tone for almost a full minute before deciding not to fire. Said the worst part wasn't thinking he was going to die. Said the worst part was realizing Voss was enjoying watching him think it. The room had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the charged, anticipatory quiet of a briefing. Something heavier. That's not a pilot, Curran said, finally low. That's something else wearing a pilot's rank. Delaney said nothing, the way she said nothing about most things. But she'd stopped writing in her notebook somewhere in the middle of Lund's story, pen hovering above the page. And something in her chest had gone tight the moment Voss's name first entered the conversations, a small, cold recognition she couldn't place yet, a name that seemed to reach backward through years she didn't want to revisit, though she couldn't have said why not then, not with any words that made sense. If anyone had been watching her closely instead of watching Kirwan, they might have noticed the way her knuckles had gone faintly pale around the pen. The only outward sign that anything Lund had said touched a nerve she kept buried far deeper than anyone at Talon Ridge had earned the right to see yet. She turned the feeling over carefully, the way she turned over most things that unsettled her, trying to locate the source of it. Nothing surfaced, just a faint, wordless disquiet, the kind that sits at the edge of memory without ever stepping fully into the light. She filed it away, the way she filed everything away, and went back to her paperback. The morning it happened started like every other morning. Heat shimmering off the tarmac before 8 a.m., the smell of jet fuel thick enough to taste. Kirwan and Lund walking out to their jets for a routine border patrol along the Ashcombe corridor. Helmets under their arms, laughing at something Lund had said that Kirwan pretended not to find funny. Delaney watched them go from the alert shack, sitting in the worn recliner she'd claimed as her own within her first week, paperback open, coffee cooling in a paper cup beside her. Outside, the windsock still hung stiff and eastward, the way it had every morning since she'd arrived, and she found herself watching it a moment longer than usual, though she couldn't have said why. She didn't know, yet, that this was the last ordinary morning any of them would have for a long time. Nobody ever does. That's the thing about the last ordinary morning. It never announces itself. It just happens, and then it's gone, and you spend the rest of your life measuring everything against the moment it ended, at 25,000 feet, The sky over the Ashcombe corridor was the kind of clear blue that made a pilot forget for a moment that anything could go wrong up there. Kirwan's F-16 cut through it in a lazy patrol pattern, lunged 1,000 feet off his wing, both radars sweeping empty air. Widowmaker flight. This is Beacon. The AWACS controller called. Voice steady through the headset. Pictures clean. Sectors quiet. Copy, Beacon, Kirwan replied. Widowmaker 1, nothing but blue sky up here. He should have known better. Everybody who'd ever flown against Obsidian Group knew that quiet sky was the loudest warning there was. The radar warning receiver screamed a half-second before Kirwan's own eyes could confirm what his instincts already understood. A shriek of electronic panic cutting through the calm of the cockpit. And Kirwan's hand was on the throttle before his brain had finished processing the threat. "Spike! Spike aft!" he barked. "Lund! Brake! Brake now!" Lund's jet peeled hard right, a violent tearing arc across the sky, and Kirwan hauled his own aircraft into a punishing climb, engine screaming, G-forces slamming him back into his seat. He never saw where the black jet came from. That was the thing about Voss. He never gave you the satisfaction of seeing him coming. He used terrain, he used sun angle, he used every trick a decade of hunting other pilots had taught him, and by the time you knew he was there, he was already behind you, already locked, already laughing. Well, the voice came through on the guard frequency, 121.5, the emergency channel every aircraft in the sky was required to monitor, which meant every pilot, every controller, every listening station within range, heard it at the same moment Kirwan did. Smooth, cultured, dripping with contempt dressed up as amusement. "Is this truly the best the Widowmakers can offer me? Get off my 6! Kirwan snarled, hauling his jet into a defensive brake turn that should have shaken anyone off his tail. It didn't shake Voss. The Black Typhoon mirrored the maneuver with an ease that made Kirwan's stomach drop through the floor of the cockpit. "I have a lock," Voss said, conversational, unhurried, like a man commenting on the weather. "I've had one for the better part of a minute. You fly like a man who's never actually been hunted before." A pause. The kind of pause designed to let terror settle in before the next line landed. "I could end you right now, Captain, but you're not worth the missile." "Beacon, I need support!" Kirwan's voice cracked, just slightly, the composure he wore like armor finally showing a seam. "I can't shake him!" Widowmaker 1. "Alert flight is scrambling now," Beacon replied, tension bleeding through the professional calm. "Hold on," Voss laughed, a dark, unhurried sound that seemed to fill the entire frequency. "I'm not going to kill you today," he said. "Instead, I have a proposal for your entire wing to consider. I am issuing a challenge." His tone sharpened, cutting clean through the static, and every controller and every pilot listening felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Send me a real aviator. Someone who has actually learned how to fight, rather than merely how to patrol a quiet border, and call it courage. I will hold position at the eastern waypoint. Angels 30. A pause. Long enough to be theatrical. "You have 10 minutes, Voss continued. Send me your best, or I will cross the corridor myself and remind you exactly why nobody at Obsidian Group fears the flag you fly under." And then, almost as an afterthought, almost casual, he added one more line, a line that meant nothing to Kirwan, nothing to Lund, nothing to the controllers scrambling to process the threat, but it meant something to somebody listening on the ground. "Tell your commander," Voss said, "that I have not forgotten the old squadron that trained under Delaney Marsh. Tell him the debt owed to that name has waited long enough." Silence. A silence so complete that, for a full 3 seconds, nobody on the frequency breathed. Then Voss pulled his black jet into a savage vertical climb and vanished into the glare of the morning sun, leaving nothing behind him but a shaken pilot, a terrified wingman, and a name that had just detonated inside a tactical operations center 200 miles away. In the operations center at Talon Ridge, Colonel Grant Whitlock had been standing behind the radar console when the transmission came through, and when Voss's final line crackled over the speakers, every drop of blood in Whitlock's face went somewhere else. Delaney Marsh. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. Not since the funeral. Not since the closed-door meetings that followed it. Meetings he'd sat through as a much younger officer. Meetings where words like classified and need to know had been used to smother 100 unanswered questions. He'd never fully let go of himself. He knew that name. He knew, with a cold certainty settling into his gut, exactly whose daughter had walked into his squadron 6 days ago, carrying a file made almost entirely of black ink. Because it wasn't a coincidence. Because nothing about a mercenary pilot invoking a dead colonel's name on an open frequency was ever a coincidence. Because somewhere in the space between what he knew and what he'd just heard, an old, uneasy feeling from 9 years ago, one he'd buried under 3 decades of duty and discipline, came clawing back up into the light. "Sir?" A young communications officer looked up from her consoles uncertain. "Sir, did he say?" "I heard what he said!" Whitlock's voice came out low, controlled, the voice of a man forcing himself to sound calmer than he felt. "Get me the scramble order now." The alarm went up a heartbeat later, a scramble klaxon shattering the ordinary rhythm of the base, and Whitlock stood frozen for one more second, amid the sudden chaos of officers moving, phones ringing, controllers shouting, coordinates 1 second, where the only thing he could see was a manila folder full of redacted pages, and a young captain's voice from 6 days earlier echoing in his memory. "I've paid it before." My God, he thought, what exactly did they pay? He thought, too, of the balcony conversation he'd half remembered and fully buried for 9 years, a memory that had never belonged to him directly, only relayed secondhand years ago from an officer who'd since retired and moved somewhere quiet and far away. A memory about a widow asking questions. A memory about someone being told to make her stop. He had never once connected that memory to the black ink file sitting on his desk. He was connecting it now. The alert shack erupted into motion the instant the klaxon sounded. Delaney was already moving before her conscious mind had finished processing the alarm. Years of training, collapsing the distance between hearing and reacting down to almost nothing. She set the paperback down. Careful, precise. A bookmark slid neatly between the pages, because even now, even with adrenaline flooding her system, some part of her insisted on order. She grabbed her helmet. She ran. Her mind, usually so quiet, so controlled, fractured into something faster and rawer as she sprinted across the tarmac. Voss. The name from the briefing. The name Kirwan had said with dread in his voice. And underneath it, some small, sharp thread she couldn't yet name pulling tight in her chest, though she had no time to follow where it led. Because there wasn't time to think. Because thinking, right now, was a luxury reserved for the ground. Ground crew scattered out of her path as she sprinted for her jet, tail number painted with the same quiet anonymity as everything else about her, and behind her the operations center was a rising storm of confusion. "Widowmaker 2 and 3 are RTB," a voice shouted over the base loudspeaker. "Low fuel, they can't turn back around." Then who's flying the intercept? Someone else demanded. Silence answered that question. A silence that stretched half a beat too long. Because the terrible arithmetic of the moment had already resolved itself, whether anyone wanted it to or not. Kirwan and Lund were bingo fuel, limping home on fumes. Every other Widowmaker pilot was either grounded for maintenance, off base, or simply too far from the flight line to matter. Except one. Whitlock stood in the doorway of the operations center, watching a single green blip streak across the radar display toward the runway, and he understood with a clarity that felt like ice water down his spine that he was about to send Colonel Nathaniel Marsh's daughter alone into the sky against the man who had just invoked her father's name like a threat. "Sir." The communications officer's voice was tight. "She's requesting immediate clearance." Whitlock closed his eyes for 1/2 second. God help her, he thought. God help both of them. Clear her, he said. Clear her now. Delaney's F-16 rolled out onto the runway with a speed that made the ground crew flinch, engine spooling toward full military power before she'd even finished her pre-takeoff checks. In the cockpit, her breathing had gone slow, measured. The controlled rhythm she'd trained herself into years ago, back when panic had nearly cost her everything, and she'd sworn silently, completely, that it never would again. She ran her checklist by feel, by memory, hands moving faster than conscious thought could keep pace with. And somewhere underneath the discipline, a single sentence kept surfacing no matter how many times she pushed it back down. He said my father's name, which meant something, which meant she was flying toward more than a border skirmish. So focus, so breathe, so fly the jet. Fly the jet, don't let the jet fly you, because whatever's waiting out there at Angels 30, you are not going to meet it rattled. Talon Tower, Widowmaker 4, ready for immediate departure. Her voice came through flat, steady, nothing in it betraying the storm underneath. Widowmaker 4, you are cleared for immediate takeoff. A pause on the other end, the controller's voice tightening with something that might have been fear on her behalf. Godspeed, Captain. She didn't answer that. She shoved the throttle forward instead, felt the afterburner catch with a roar that shook the whole airframe, and the F-16 surged down the runway and lifted off the desert floor like something finally released from a held breath. Behind her, on the ground, Whitlock watched the blip climbing on radar and felt something crack open in his chest, grief and dread, and a terrible dawning understanding all tangled together, because he was starting to understand now exactly what kind of daughter Nathaniel Marsh had raised, and exactly what kind of debt Damien Voss believed was owed. A Pentagon liaison officer appeared in the doorway behind him, breathless, a slim encrypted drive clutched in one hand. Colonel Whitlock. His voice was urgent. Careful. Given the current operational emergency, the Pentagon has approved release of the remaining classified sections in Captain Marsh's file. Effective immediately. Whitlock turned, took the drive with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Get it decrypted, he said now. Before she's back on the ground, because somewhere out past the horizon, a single gray jet was climbing toward 30,000 feet, toward a black-painted Typhoon, and a man who had just spoken her father's name like an accusation. And Whitlock had a horrible, gathering certainty that whatever was hidden behind those redacted pages, it was about to matter more than anything else in the world. The klaxon kept sounding behind him. The radar screen kept tracking a single blip climbing east, and somewhere over the Ashcombe corridor, Delaney Marsh flew on in silence. The way she always flew, the way she'd learned to survive one steady breath at a time, one click of a radio switch at a time, carrying a name and a debt she didn't yet fully understand toward a man who was about to learn exactly what that silence had been hiding all along. Below her, Talon Ridge shrank into the haze, a small cluster of buildings and runways holding its breath alongside every soul who watched her climb. Above her the sky waited, empty, patient, endless. Delaney leveled off through 18,000 feet, the desert floor unspooling beneath her in long amber ridgelines, and let herself have exactly one unguarded thought before locking everything else behind the same discipline that had carried her through every fight that had ever mattered. He said your father's name, D, which means somebody remembers, which means somewhere out there, past the horizon, is a man who knows something about 9 years of silence that nobody has ever been willing to tell you. Which means today isn't just a border skirmish. Today is a door. She thought of her father's voice, patient, unhurried, the way he'd sounded on every quiet airstrip of her childhood. Fly the airplane, D. Don't let the airplane fly you. She thought of her mother, 5 years gone now, who had asked questions until she'd stopped asking questions, and had never once explained why, and had carried whatever she knew all the way to a quiet grave that never got the chance to say goodbye properly. Not really, not with the truth still sealed somewhere behind black ink and closed doors. She thought of the hallway. 20 years old, black dress, 2 voices through a cracked window. She's asking questions. Then somebody needs to tell her to stop. 9 years of silence. And here she was climbing alone into a sky that held whatever answer had been waiting for her all along, carrying nothing but a jet, a name, and a stillness that had never once, in 9 long years, been anything close to peace. It had only ever been patience. And patience, she understood now, climbing higher through air gone thin and cold and endless, was simply grief that hadn't finished waiting for its moment yet. Hers was about to arrive. Somewhere within that sky, at exactly 30,000 feet, a man who believed he already knew how this story would end was about to discover how wrong he was. And somewhere behind her, on the ground, an old colonel sat over a decrypting file with his hands not quite steady, about to learn that the daughter he'd sent alone into the sky was carrying a great deal more than black ink and blank pages. She was carrying everything her silence had ever protected, and she was done protecting it quietly. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, military units, call signs, and events are entirely invented and do not depict real individuals, real operations, or real organizations. The decrypted file loaded onto Whitlock's terminal in pieces. Not all at once. Not the way it should have. Because whoever built the security wrapper had built it to unspool slowly, page by page, like they wanted a reader to feel every second of what was coming. Whitlock didn't have time for slow. He had a communications officer standing behind him, refreshing the radar plot every 4 seconds. He had a scramble klaxon still ringing somewhere down the hallway in his skull, even though it had gone silent 5 minutes ago. He had a single green blip climbing east at 900 knots, carrying a woman he'd known for 6 days into a fight against a man who had just said her father's name on an open frequency like a verdict. So he sat, and he read, and the first page told him nothing he didn't already suspect. Captain Delaney R. Marsh, daughter of Colonel Nathaniel A. Marsh, deceased 9 years prior. Cause: aircraft mishap during authorized training flight. Ashcombe restricted corridor, which was the same sentence that had been sitting in every public record for 9 years, which told him nothing. Except the next page wasn't public. The next page had a classification banner Whitlock had only seen twice in his career, and both times it had been attached to programs that got mentioned in rooms with no windows. Task Force Solace Eyes, only compartmented. He read it once. He didn't believe it, so he read it again. 3 years before she'd ever set foot at Talon Ridge, Delaney Marsh had been assigned to a program that officially never existed, flying out of a forward staging platform that officially wasn't there, testing aircraft the Pentagon officially hadn't built yet, which was how she'd ended up, on a night with no moon over open water nobody would ever name in a briefing, on the wrong end of an ambush that should have killed her in the first 90 seconds. 4 aircraft, advanced, stealth configured, flown by pilots who'd trained their whole careers for exactly this kind of hunt. Her flight lead had gone down in the opening exchange, fireball on the water, before he'd even had time to call the threat. And what should have happened next, what training said should happen next, what every tactic in every manual said should happen next, was that the surviving pilot broke off, ran for friendly airspace, lived to fly another day. She hadn't run. Whitlock read the after-action summary with his jaw tightening by the paragraph. Read how she'd killed her own radio the instant her flight-lead's aircraft hit the water, not out of panic. The report insisted, but by deliberate choice, because an open channel was a beacon, and a beacon was a death sentence. Read how she'd disabled her own onboard safety limiters, a violation so severe it should have ended her career on its own, except nobody who reviewed the tape afterward had the stomach to write her up for it. Read how she'd fought 15 minutes of the most brutal, silent, sustained air combat, maneuvering anyone on that program had ever documented, and dismantled all 4 aircraft, one at a time, without saying a single word over any frequency until the last one went down. The surviving enemy pilots, the 2 who'd ejected and lived to be debriefed, described something that didn't sound like a person. They described a shape, a presence that predicted their next move before they'd finished thinking it, that never announced an attack, that simply arrived, every time, exactly where they least expected it, silent as weather. One of them, according to the transcript, had refused to fly again for 4 months afterward. Whitlock set the page down, picked it back up, read it a 3rd time, because some part of him needed it to say something different than what it said the first 2 times, and it never did. My God, he thought, we didn't send Voss a sacrifice. He looked up at the radar plot. The single blip, still climbing, still alone, Still 9 minutes from a merge with the deadliest mercenary pilot in the hemisphere. We sent him a reckoning. At 28,000 feet, the sky had gone the particular shade of pale, merciless blue that only exists at the edge of the atmosphere. Thin air, thin margins. The kind of altitude where a mistake doesn't announce itself before it kills you. Delaney's F-16 leveled off there, engines settling into a low, controlled hum, and she scanned the horizon with the same flat patience she brought to everything. Her radar warning receiver chirped once, soft, distant. He was out there. Widowmaker 4, this is Beacon. The AWACS controller's voice had a tightness to it now, a strain that hadn't been there an hour ago. Bandit is 15 miles off your nose. Co-altitude, he is radiating. Repeat, he knows you're inbound. Click, click. 2 chirps on the radio switch, her only reply. And in the AWACS aircraft 200 miles behind her, a young radar operator glanced at his supervisor with something close to alarm. Is her radio broken? The senior controller didn't answer right away. Because he'd read the same rumors everyone had read. Because he'd heard the same theories about the silent captain nobody knew anything about. And because, watching that single green blip hold a perfectly steady course toward a known killer without a single word of hesitation, he was starting to understand that the silence wasn't a malfunction. It was a choice. No, he said finally. She's not broken. He didn't finish the thought out loud. She's something else entirely. 10 miles out, Voss's voice bled onto the guard frequency again. Unhurried, amused, carrying easily over 1,000 miles of empty sky. Only one, he said. How disappointing. A pause, deliberate, theatrical. The kind of pause a man uses when he already believes he owns the room. Your telemetry shows a straight line. No offset, no evasive weave. Tell me, little Widowmaker, are you the sacrifice they've sent to buy the rest of them time? Silence answered him, which only seemed to sharpen his appetite. I shot a man down last month, Voss continued, voice dropping, almost gentle now, almost intimate. He screamed for his mother when the missile came off the rail. I wonder what you'll scream for. Click. Click, that was all he got. In the cockpit, Delaney's hands stayed loose on the stick and throttle. Light. Relaxed. Because tension killed reaction time. And reaction time was the only currency that mattered in the next 90 seconds. And because somewhere underneath the calm, somewhere she didn't let surface, not yet a small, cold voice had started keeping score. He talks a great deal for a man who has already lost. She didn't know yet how true that was. She would. The merge happened at 5 miles, closing speed over 1,500 knots. 2 aircraft crossing paths in a blur too fast for the human eye to properly register. Merge in 3, 2, 1. Merged, Beacon called out, voice clipped with tension. And then the fight began. Voss hauled his black Typhoon into an aggressive vertical loop the instant they passed, intending to drop in behind her, before she'd even had time to react a maneuver that had ended 6 confirmed engagements in his favor. A maneuver he trusted the way other men trusted gravity. Except when he crested the loop and rolled to look for her, the sky was empty. What? The word slipped out of him before he could stop it. Unpolished, unguarded, the first genuine crack in his composure. He rolled the Typhoon hard, scanning, searching. Where she dropped low, fast. Using the Doppler notched the small, brutal blind spot in every look-down radar system. The sliver of geometry where a target's closing speed matches the ground clutter speed exactly and simply vanishes from the screen. It was a maneuver that required precision most pilots never developed in a full career. She'd developed it somewhere over open water 3 years ago, against 4 aircraft, with no name for what she was doing except survive. Vanguard Control, this is Voss. His voice, still smooth, still cultured, carried the faintest new edge now. Irritation. Something close to disbelief. Give me a vector. Where did she go? We've lost her, the Obsidian controller replied, static crackling. She dropped into your notch. Check your low 6, Leon, check it now. Voss rolled inverted, looked down through the canopy at the sparkling stretch of desert scrubland 15,000 feet below. There, a gray shape, diving hard toward the deck, building energy she had no apparent intention of spending yet. Clever, Voss murmured, almost admiring, before his voice hardened back into its usual arrogance. But altitude only delays the inevitable, little ghost. He pushed the throttle forward, Dove after her. Neither of them knew, yet, how wrong that sentence would turn out to be. At 18,000 feet, the fight found its first real rhythm, a savage, spiraling dance of energy and angles. Both aircraft trading altitude for speed and speed for angles in a pattern that would have looked, from the ground, like nothing so much as two hawks locked in a death spiral over open desert. Delaney flew with a stillness that unsettled even the OWOC's crew watching her telemetry from 200 miles away. No wasted motion, no panic inputs. Every maneuver arriving a half-second before it was needed, never a half-second after. Voss flew like a man convinced of his own inevitability. Aggressive, elegant, merciless. And for the first 6 minutes, neither of them gained a decisive edge, which had never happened to Voss before. Which was, itself, information, and somewhere underneath his composure, a small, unfamiliar sensation began to stir. Something close to fear. He didn't like it. So he did what he always did when a fight refused to bend to him. He talked. "Your father," Voss said suddenly, breaking a long silence, his voice cutting through the static with deliberate, surgical precision. "Colonel Nathaniel Marsh. I imagine you've spent a great many nights wondering exactly how he died." The words hit her like a physical blow, because for one half-second, one single, catastrophic half-second, Delaney's hands tightened on the stick, and her aircraft's flight path deviated by 3 degrees. A margin so small no human eye could have caught it. Voss caught it. He'd been watching for exactly that. "There it is," he said, satisfaction dripping through the frequency. I wondered how long the silence would hold. "Don't." The thought arrived in her chest like a slammed door. Don't let him in. Don't let him have this. Except he already had it. Because the mention of her father's name had done what 6 confirmed kills worth of terror tactics had never managed to do to any other pilot she'd ever fought. It had made her feel something, and feeling something, up here at 18,000 feet, with 1,500 knots of closing speed, and a man who fed on exactly this kind of crack feeling something was the single most dangerous thing a pilot could do. "You don't get to say his name," she said. Her voice, when it finally came, wasn't flat anymore. It was ice with something burning underneath it. Voss laughed, delighted, because he'd finally found the door, and now all he had to do was push it open. "Careful," he murmured. "I know a great deal more about your father's name than you might expect, little ghost. I was there." The words detonated inside her skull. There where? There when? What does that mean? There? Her mind fractured into fragments, thoughts arriving faster than she could organize them, and for one terrifying stretch of 2 full seconds, Captain Delaney Marsh, the woman who never lost her composure, who had once fought 4 aircraft in total silence, and never let a single tremor into her voice, very nearly lost the fight, because a stranger in a black jet had just cracked open a door she'd spent 9 years welding shut, until training took over, until the part of her that had survived worse than this much worse, though she didn't consciously remember choosing to survive it, only that she had reasserted itself with a force that felt almost violent. Not now. Not up here. Fly the jet. Fly the jet. Fly the jet. She shoved the thought down, buried it, locked her breathing back into the rhythm she'd trained into muscle memory over a decade, and when she spoke again, her voice had found its way back to something almost steady. "Then you'll have the chance to explain it," she said. "After I put you on the ground." 9 years earlier, in a memory she never let surface except in the smallest, most guarded hours of the night, 20-year-old Delaney Marsh had stood in a hallway outside a squadron operations building with a duffel bag over one shoulder, home on leave from her 2nd year of flight training, waiting for her mother to finish a conversation that wasn't supposed to happen where she could hear it. The building had been quiet, late evening, most of the staff gone home, which was exactly why the 2 voices behind the half-closed door carried as far as they did. "I'm telling you, she's not going to stop," her mother's voice, tired, frightened in a way Delaney had never heard from her before. Not once. not through a childhood spent following a fighter pilot from base to base. She's already put in 3 separate information requests. The investigation board, the safety office, everyone. Then somebody needs to make her stop. A man's voice, older, clipped with the particular authority of someone used to being obeyed without argument. This isn't a request, Mrs. Marsh. It's a courtesy. There are things about that flight that are never going to see daylight, and the longer your daughter keeps digging, the more people she puts at risk, including herself. He was my husband, and he died the way the report says he died. Mechanical failure. Full stop. I understand your grief. I don't understand why you'd let your daughter chase ghosts through classified channels she has no clearance to access. A long silence. 20-year-old Delaney had stood frozen in that hallway, duffel bag straps cutting into her shoulder, heart slamming so loud she was certain it would give her away. Ghosts, she'd thought. He said ghosts. Not questions. Ghosts. Because you didn't tell a grieving widow to stop chasing ghosts unless there was something real underneath the word. Because mechanical failure, full stop, wasn't the kind of sentence a man delivered with that particular hardness in his voice, unless full stop was doing an enormous amount of work, holding something else in place. She'd never confronted her mother about it, never told her she'd heard. Because 2 weeks later, her mother had stopped asking questions, entirely stopped so completely, so abruptly, that even at 20 years old, still raw with grief of her own, Delaney had understood the change wasn't grief settling into acceptance. It was fear settling into silence. And 5 years after that, when her mother passed, the questions passed with her. Unanswered, unspoken, buried under a decade of careful avoidance that Delaney had built her entire adult life around maintaining. Until now. Until a stranger in a black jet, 15,000 feet above a desert corridor, had just told her he was there. Back in the present, back at 18,000 feet, the fight had dropped into a lower, tighter spiral, both aircraft bleeding altitude as they traded angles, and Delaney flew through the memory and the merge at the same time, some deep-trained part of her hands and instincts holding the aircraft steady, while the rest of her mind fought a different, older battle entirely. He said he was there, which means he knows something, which means 9 years of silence just cracked open 30,000 feet above a desert nobody will ever put on a map. So focus, so fly. Because if you die up here, the answer dies with you, and you have waited 9 years, you are not losing this now. You've gone quiet again, Voss observed, his voice needling through the static. I thought I'd earned more of a reaction than that. You'll get your reaction, Delaney said. When I decide you've earned it. Something in her tone made even Voss pause. Because it wasn't defensive anymore. It was patient. And patient, in a fighter pilot with her hands still steady on the controls after the kind of blow he'd just landed, was somehow far more unsettling than rage would have been. At 12,000 feet, the fight dragged into thicker, heavier air, and Delaney made her first deliberate move to drag it there. Because the F-16's sustained turn rate improved dramatically in denser air, and because every second Voss spent chasing her down through the atmosphere was a second his Typhoon burned fuel it couldn't easily spare. You want to fight in the mud? Voss snarled, some of his polish finally slipping. Then I'll bury you in it. He rolled inverted. Dove. The black Typhoon tore through the thickening air, closing the gap with terrifying speed, radar finally burning through the low-altitude clutter to reacquire her position. Voss's thumb found the weapons release, resting there, waiting for the tone. I have you, he thought, savoring it. He never got the tone, because at the exact moment his aircraft crossed into optimal firing range, Delaney's F-16 snapped upward in a maneuver so violent it condensed the humid desert air across her wings into a thick, trailing veil of vapor, and in the same motion she dumped a spread of magnesium flares across the sky behind her and slammed her throttle to idle, deploying speed brakes in a move designed to do exactly one thing: make him overshoot. Voss, diving at well over the speed his weapons system needed for a clean shot, tore straight through the wall of flares, his radar screaming false locks, his cockpit flooding with heat signatures that weren't her, and by the time his instruments cleared, he'd blown past her position entirely. No, the word tore out of him, raw, furious, all pretense of composure gone. No, he hauled back on the stick, desperate to regain the offensive, the Typhoon groaning under the sudden stress. Too late. Delaney had already rolled her throttle back into afterburner, tucking her F-16 neatly into the blind spot behind him, with a precision that felt, to the OAX crew watching the telemetry 200 miles away, less like flying and more like inevitability. "She's on him," the senior controller breathed, disbelief cracking his professional calm. "She's actually on him." In the operations center at Talon Ridge, Whitlock stood with the decrypted file still open on the desk beside him, watching the same radar plot. And for the first time since the klaxon had sounded, something in his chest loosened. Not relief. Not yet. Something closer to understanding. There it is, he thought. There's the ghost from the file. At 8,000 feet, cornered, out of answers, Voss did the only thing left to a man whose every trick had just failed him in sequence. He talked faster. "You want to know how he died," Voss said, voice ragged now, stripped of its earlier polish, each word coming out clipped and desperate between the punishing G-forces of his own evasive turns. "I can tell you. I was flying test support that night. Contracted. Before Obsidian. Before any of this." "Talk," Delaney said, flat, deadly calm, her F-16 mirroring his every desperate movement with an ease that had stopped feeling like skill and started feeling like fate. There was a jamming pod, Voss gasped, hauling his jet through another violent brake turn that Delaney matched half a second later without effort. Experimental. Meant to disrupt enemy targeting radar. We were told it was cleared. Told it was safe to run active during a live training corridor. Told by who? "I don't know his name." Voss's voice cracked, genuine panic, bleeding through now, the arrogance of the last 20 minutes stripped down to something raw and frightened. "I was a contractor. I flew where I was told. I activated what I was told to activate. And 40 seconds later, your father's aircraft lost all flight control telemetry and went into the ground before he ever had a chance to eject silence. A silence so complete, so total, that even the static seemed to hold its breath. Because there it was. 9 years of black ink, 9 years of hushed voices behind half-closed doors. 9 years of a mother who stopped asking questions and never explained why. And a daughter who'd built an entire silent, armored life around a grief she'd never been allowed to properly understand. And here it was, finally, delivered at 8,000 feet by a mercenary pilot fighting for his life. In a voice too frightened now to lie. It wasn't an accident. It was never an accident. It was a piece of equipment that shouldn't have been running, cleared by someone whose name Voss doesn't even know. And my father paid for somebody else's mistake with his life. And then somebody made sure nobody ever found out. "Who ordered it active?" Delaney said. Her voice had gone somewhere Voss hadn't heard from her yet. Somewhere past ice. Somewhere close to grief wearing the shape of a weapon. "I don't know!" Voss's aircraft shuddered as he wrenched it through another desperate turn. The Typhoon's airframe groaning under stress it was never designed to sustain at this altitude. "I only know it wasn't my decision, and I only know that afterward, someone made it very clear that if I ever spoke of it, I would not live long enough to spend whatever they paid me. That is the truth. That is the entire truth I have." "Not the entire truth," Delaney said, because she could hear it. The gap. The thing he still hadn't said. "There's a name," she said. "Somewhere in what you're not saying, there's a name." Voss didn't answer. For the first time in the entire engagement, he didn't answer. And in that silence, in the terrible, charged, unbearable weight of it, Delaney understood two things with equal and devastating clarity. The first was that Damien Voss knew exactly whose orders had killed her father, and had simply decided, even now, even with her cannon tracking his every desperate movement, that some fears outweighed even the fear of dying. The second was that she was not going to let him eject without finding out which one. Vanguard, Voss's voice cracked over his own encrypted channel, no longer performing for anyone, stripped down to raw desperation. "I need extraction now. She has me. She has me. There's no extraction in this sector, Leon, the obsidian controller replied. Static crackling with something that sounded almost like pity. You're on your own. I can't break off! Voss's voice climbed towards something close to panic now. The arrogance of 20 minutes ago, a distant memory. She won't let me leave. He was right! Every time he tried to roll out and run for the eastern border, Delaney was already there, cutting the angle before he'd finished committing to it. Her cannon tracer rounds carving brilliant lines of fire just off his wingtip, never striking, never needing to strike, simply closing every door he tried to open, hurting him. Back at Talon Ridge, Whitlock watched the telemetry with his jaw locked tight, the decrypted file still open on the desk beside him, and understood, with a certainty that settled into his bones like cold water, that he was witnessing something he would never be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. She wasn't trying to kill Voss. Not yet. She was extracting something far more valuable than a kill, and she was doing it the only way she knew how, with patience, with precision, and with a silence that had just, for the first time in 9 years, found a target worth breaking for. At 6,000 feet, the fight tightened into its final desperate turns. The black typhoon bleeding energy it could no longer afford to lose, its pilot flying now on pure adrenaline, and the thin, fraying thread of a man who understood finally, completely, that he had badly misjudged exactly who he'd challenged that morning. Say the name, Delaney said. Her voice, over the open frequency, carried to every station listening across 200 miles of desert. Say it, and I let you eject clean. Keep it, and we both find out how far you're willing to fall to protect it. A long, ragged breath crackled over the channel. You don't understand, Voss said, and for the first time, underneath the terror, there was something that sounded almost like genuine regret. The man who gave that order is not someone your rank or your record can touch. Not even with everything you've just heard. He has spent 9 years making certain of that. Try me. Voss's aircraft shuddered violently, warning tones screaming through his cockpit as his airspeed bled below the threshold his wings needed to generate lift. I can't. Not like this. Not while you have a gun tracking my spine and the ground coming up to meet me. Delaney's cannon sight settled, rock steady, on the center of his fuselage. Then you'd better start climbing, she said. Because I'm not finished asking. But the ground was closer than either of them had accounted for. The fight having spiraled lower than either pilot fully realized in the heat of it, and Voss's stalled, shuddering typhoon had run out of altitude to trade for answers. His voice came through one final time, stripped of everything: the arrogance, the theater, the careful cruelty he'd worn like armor for 6 confirmed kills and a reputation built on other pilots' terror. His name begins with. The transmission cut. Not from a missile, not from her cannon, which she hadn't fired, from an emergency departure warning tone blaring through his own cockpit as the typhoon's stall finally became unrecoverable, and Damien Voss's hand shot toward the ejection handle a half-second before his aircraft would have made the decision for him. Static. Nothing but static, roaring across the guard frequency where a name should have been. Delaney Marsh pulled her F-16 into a steep, controlled climb away from the falling black jet, cannon still cold, trigger never pulled, and stared through her canopy at an empty parachute drifting toward a desert floor that had very nearly swallowed the one answer she'd waited 9 years to hear. So close, and he still got away with it. Except he hadn't gotten away with the jet. And he hadn't gotten away with his freedom. Not with an entire operations center at Talon Ridge, already vectoring a recovery team toward his drifting parachute. Which meant the name he hadn't finished saying wasn't gone. It was only delayed, and somewhere over a desert corridor that had just witnessed the truth crack open after 9 years of silence. Captain Delaney Marsh understood, with a clarity sharper than anything she'd felt since the night of her father's funeral, that the fight in the sky had just ended. The one on the ground was only beginning. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, military units, callsigns, and events are entirely invented and do not depict real individuals, real operations, or real organizations. The parachute canopy caught the wind wrong on the way down, twisted, collapsed halfway. which meant Damien Voss hit the desert floor harder than any ejection should ever let a man hit anything, and by the time the recovery helicopter found him sprawled in a wash of dry scrub brush 12 miles east of the Ashcombe corridor, he wasn't running. He wasn't even trying. He was just lying there, staring up at a sky that had, 20 minutes earlier, belonged to him. Because that was the thing about falling from 30,000 feet of certainty down to flat desert dirt. It didn't just break bones. Sometimes it broke something else first. The recovery team found him with a fractured wrist, a gash above one eyebrow, and an expression that the sergeant on scene would later describe, in his after-action report, as a man who already knew the worst part of his day hadn't happened yet. He was right about that. Whitlock met the recovery convoy at the flight line himself. Didn't send a junior officer. Didn't delegate it to security forces and wait for a summary later. He stood at the edge of the tarmac in the flat white heat of mid-morning, arms crossed, jaw set, watching a military police vehicle roll to a stop with Damien Voss zip-tied in the back seat, and something in Whitlock's chest had gone very quiet and very cold. Because he'd read the file, because he knew, now, exactly what question was about to get asked in whatever room they put this man in. And because 40 minutes earlier, he'd watched a single gray F-16 come screaming back over the runway threshold, wings rocking once in a gesture no training manual ever taught anyone, before settling into a landing so smooth it looked almost gentle, almost like nothing had happened at all up there, almost like the woman climbing down that ladder hadn't just spent the last half hour pulling a 9-year-old wound open at 15,000 feet. She had, though. He could see it on her. Delaney climbed down from her jet with her flight suit soaked through at the collar, hands steady, face unreadable except for her eyes. Which weren't unreadable at all, which were burning with something Whitlock hadn't seen in 6 days of watching her. Not triumph. Not relief. Something closer to hunger. The ground crew backed away from her without being told to. Even Kirwan, who'd landed 20 minutes earlier on fumes and had been standing at the edge of the flight line ever since, watching the radar feed on someone's tablet with an expression Delaney had never once seen on his face before, something that looked unmistakably like shame. He didn't say anything to her. Not yet. There'd be time for that later. Right now there was only one thing that mattered, and it was sitting zip-tied in the back of an MP vehicle 50 yards away, bleeding from a cut above one eyebrow. He said a name, Delaney said, walking straight up to Whitlock without preamble, without the pleasantries a lesser conversation would have demanded. He didn't finish it. The ejection cut him off. "I know," Whitlock said. "I heard the whole exchange. Then you understand why I need to be in that room." It wasn't a question. Whitlock studied her for a long moment. The heat shimmered between them. Somewhere behind him, an engine wound down with a long mechanical sigh, and neither of them moved until it finished. "Captain," he said finally, "you understand that man is a foreign national contracted to a private military organization we have been actively hostile with for 18 months. There are protocols, chain of custody, people above my pay grade who are going to want a say in how this interrogation happens. I don't care about protocols. I know you don't." Something almost gentle crossed his face. "That's exactly why I need you to care, just this once. Because if this gets done wrong, whatever he says in that room becomes worthless. Legally, operationally. Every way that matters." Delaney's jaw tightened. "So do it right," she said. "But do it fast. He already showed me once that fear outlasts him longer than the truth does. Give that fear time to reorganize itself, and he'll bury the name again. Maybe for good this time." Whitlock held her gaze. 9 years of silence stood behind her eyes, and he understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically heavy, that he was looking at the daughter of a man he'd once considered a friend, a man whose death had never made sense to him either, not fully, not in a way he'd ever let himself sit with for very long. "All right," he said, "you're in the room, but I lead it. Fine, and Captain." He stopped her before she could turn away. "Whatever he says in there, whatever name comes out of his mouth, you do not act on it alone. Do you understand me? Not one more inch of this happens without command oversight. or I promise you, whatever he knows dies with him in a jurisdictional argument that outlives both of us." Delaney held his gaze a long moment. "Understood," she said. It wasn't quite a promise. Whitlock heard the difference, filed it away, and walked toward the MP vehicle with the uneasy sense that he'd just made an agreement with a woman who had already decided, somewhere deep beneath that flat, controlled exterior, exactly how far she was willing to go to finish what her mother had started 9 years ago and never gotten to finish herself. They put Voss in a small interview room in the base security building's cinderblock walls, painted the particular shade of gray that exists nowhere except government buildings. A metal table bolted to the floor, a single window with reinforced glass looking out onto a hallway. He sat with his fractured wrist in a temporary splint, the cut above his eyebrow butterflied shut, and when Whitlock and Delaney walked in together, something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition. And underneath it, something closer to relief. "You're the interrogator, then," Voss said, looking at Delaney, his cultured accent thinner now, worn down by adrenaline and pain, and the particular exhaustion that comes after nearly dying twice in one morning. "I confess I expected someone with more paperwork and less altitude experience." "Cute," Delaney said. "Save it." Whitlock set a folder on the table between them, though he didn't open it. A formality more than anything. A signal to the recording equipment, mounted discreetly in the corner, that this conversation was happening within whatever thin legal framework they'd managed to construct in the last 40 minutes. "Mr. Voss," Whitlock said, "you are currently in the custody of the United States Air Force following an act of aggression against a member of this squadron. You have the right to legal representation. You have the right to remain silent." "I'm well acquainted with rights," Voss said. "I've simply never had much use for the second one." His eyes drifted back to Delaney. "You want the name," he said. "I could see it on you at 8,000 feet. I can see it now." "Yes." "Then understand something first." He shifted in his chair, wincing at the movement of his splinted wrist. "I have flown for Obsidian Group for 6 years. I have seen what happens to men who cross the people behind that name. It is not merely professional consequence. It is not a bad performance review." His voice dropped, and for the first time the arrogance was entirely gone from it. "It is disappearance. Quiet. Complete. As though the person had simply never existed." "And yet you're about to tell me anyway," Delaney said. Voss studied her for a long moment. "Because I fell out of the sky this morning believing I was going to die," he said slowly. "And somewhere in that fall, Captain, I discovered I would rather live the rest of my life as a man who told the truth in a cinderblock room than as a man who protected a secret that got your father killed for someone else's convenience." A ragged breath. "That is not forgiveness. I am not asking for it. I am simply telling you why the fear finally lost." Silence stretched across the table. Whitlock didn't move, didn't speak, understood, with the instincts of a man who'd sat through hundreds of debriefs in his career, that this was not a moment to interrupt. "His name," Voss said, "is Preston Wardell." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Whitlock's expression didn't change, which was itself an answer. "You know that name," Delaney said, turning to him, reading the stillness on his face the way she'd learned to read everything the small tells, the almost nothing shifts that meant something enormous underneath. "I know that name," Whitlock said quietly. "Everyone in this business knows that name." Preston Wardell was not a soldier. He had never worn a uniform, never flown an aircraft, never stood a watch. He was, according to the small amount of publicly available information Whitlock could recite from memory without needing to look it up, the founder and majority stakeholder of a private defense contracting firm called Meridian Systems Group, a company that had spent 2 decades quietly winning classified testing contracts across half a dozen advanced weapons programs, building a reputation for innovation that outpaced its reputation for oversight. 9 years ago, according to what Voss now claimed, Meridian Systems Group had been running an experimental electronic warfare pod through unauthorized live testing inside a restricted training corridor testing that should never have been active during a manned flight. Testing that had been certified safe through paperwork that, Voss insisted, had been forged at Wardell's direct order to save the company a testing delay worth millions of dollars in contract penalties. Colonel Nathaniel Marsh's aircraft had flown directly through that testing window, had lost all flight control telemetry in under 40 seconds, had never had the chance to eject. And in the 9 years since, Preston Wardell had built Meridian Systems Group into one of the largest private defense contractors in the country, a company so deeply woven into procurement pipelines across 3 separate branches of service that unwinding it, exposing it, holding it accountable for anything would require a level of political and legal will that most people in positions to apply it simply didn't have the appetite for. He funds Obsidian Group, Voss continued, voice steadying now that the worst of it was out, quietly, through 3 layers of shell entities that would take your government's finest forensic accountants the better part of a year to fully untangle. Obsidian provides deniable muscle for the corridors where Meridian tests things it should not be testing. I have spent 6 years enforcing a border that exists to protect his secrets, Captain. I did not know when I took this contract that one of those secrets was your father. When did you find out? The morning I received my assignment orders for the Ashcombe corridor. His jaw tightened. I recognized the coordinates. I remembered the incident. I told myself it was coincidence. I have told myself a great many convenient things over the last 6 years. Delaney sat with that for a long moment. 9 years of silence, and it had never been an accident. 9 years of black ink and hushed voices in hallways, and it had never been about protecting classified programs. It had been about protecting a company, a man, a number on a balance sheet that mattered more, apparently, than a colonel's life or a family's right to grieve with the truth in hand. My mother knew, she said quietly. Not quite a question. I don't know what your mother knew, Voss said, and for the first time, something that looked genuinely like sympathy crossed his face. I only know what I have told you. But if she was asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable, Captain, I imagine she knew more than anyone was ever willing to admit to her. Delaney closed her eyes. Just for a moment, just long enough to let 9 years settle into a shape she could finally hold. He said ghosts. She could hear the man's voice from that hallway again, the one from her memory, clipped and cold. There are things about that flight that will never see daylight. He wasn't protecting classified information. He was protecting Preston Wardell. When she opened her eyes again, Whitlock was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not pity. She wouldn't have tolerated pity. Something closer to solidarity. The look of a man who just watched a 9-year-old wall come down and understood immediately that he was now responsible for what came next. This isn't going to be simple, he said quietly. A man like Wardell doesn't fall because a mercenary pilot names him in an interview room. He has lawyers. He has friends in procurement offices across the Pentagon. He has spent 9 years making sure this exact conversation could never happen. I know, Delaney said. So what do you want to do? She was quiet for a long moment. What do you want to do? 9 years of imagining this moment, and she'd never once let herself picture what came after the name. She'd only ever pictured the name itself, a shape in the dark she could finally see the edges of. I want it documented, she said finally. Everything. Every word he just said. Recorded, sworn, time-stamped, before fear finds its way back into that room and convinces him to recant it. She looked at Voss. And I want him protected. Not for his sake, for the sake of what he knows. Whitlock nodded slowly. That, he said, I can do. The next 3 days moved with the strange, disjointed rhythm of a base processing something too large to fully metabolize. Voss's statement went up the chain through channels. Whitlock personally walked to make sure nothing got lost, softened, or quietly buried. Along the way, a JAG officer flown in from the regional headquarters to formally record and notarize the confession. A separate encrypted line opened directly to an inspector general's office that, as far as Whitlock could determine, had no prior relationship with Meridian Systems Group, and therefore no obvious incentive to look away. It wasn't justice yet. Wardell hadn't been arrested, hadn't even been publicly named. Men like that didn't fall in 3 days, and everyone in that operations center understood it. What they had for now was a sworn statement, a paper trail beginning to form, and a growing quiet certainty among the people who mattered that the story could no longer be fully contained. It was a start. It was more than 9 years of silence had ever given her. Kirwan found her on the second evening, sitting alone on the low concrete wall outside the squadron building, watching the sun drop behind the western ridgeline in a wash of orange and violet that turned the whole desert the color of something on fire. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down on the wall beside her, a respectful distance away, and stared at the same horizon she was staring at. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "You don't?" "I do." He turned to look at her, and there was none of the swagger left in his face. None of the certainty he'd worn like a second uniform since the day she'd walked into that ready room. "I called you creepy. I called you a liability. I told half the squadron you were probably some kind of psychological experiment, and the whole time you were carrying—" He stopped, shook his head. "I don't even know how to finish that sentence." "You couldn't have known. That's not really the point, Marsh." His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "The point is I decided who you were before I ever bothered to ask. And that's on me, not on you, not on whatever's in that file." Delaney studied him for a long moment. "You flew well up there," she said finally, "against Voss. Before I launched. You bought time nobody else could have bought." Kirwan huffed out something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Coming from you, I think that's the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. Don't get used to it." And there it was, the smallest twitch at the corner of her mouth, the ghost of a smile she'd been rationing since the day she arrived. And Kirwan caught it, and something in his chest loosened at finally seeing proof that there was a person under all that stillness after all. "For what it's worth," he said, standing brushing dust off his flight suit, "Titan's a stupid call sign next to whatever they end up giving you after this. They haven't given me anything yet." "They will," Kirwan said. "Trust me." He was right. 3 days after the engagement over the Ashcombe corridor, the entire 91st Fighter Squadron gathered on the flight line at the end of the duty day, not for an official ceremony, nothing that formal, nothing that would show up on any calendar. Just the squadron, ground crew included, maintenance included. Everyone who'd watched a green blip climb alone into a fight nobody expected her to survive, let alone win. Delaney stood near her jet, still in her flight suit, sweat damp, from a training sortie that had felt almost absurdly ordinary compared to everything that had come before it. Whitlock stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally gotten to see the full shape of something he'd only glimpsed in fragments a week ago. Kirwan stepped forward first. He didn't make a speech, didn't need to. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his flight suit and pulled out a small patch black Velcro backing, silver embroidered thread, and held it out to her without a word. She looked down at it. One word, stitched in careful, deliberate silver. "Spectre." "Figured it fit," Kirwan said, voice rough around the edges, considering. Delaney took the patch, turned it over once in her fingers, and then, without any ceremony at all, pressed it onto the blank Velcro strip on her own flight suit, the strip that had sat empty since the day she'd arrived, the strip that had marked her to every pilot on this base as someone without a name that mattered. It mattered now. Around her, the squadron didn't cheer, exactly. Wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, there was something quieter, a ripple of nods, a few claps on the shoulder, Lund grinning at her from across the crowd with an expression that said, unmistakably, "I told you so," in my own quiet way. I told everyone so. She caught Whitlock's eye across the flight line. He gave her a single nod. It was enough. That night, Whitlock asked her to stop by his office one more time. She found him standing by the window, the same window he'd been standing beside on her very first day, watching 2 jets taxi past on the tarmac below. "I have something for you," he said without turning around. "It's been sitting in a record storage facility for 9 years. Nobody flagged it for review, because nobody thought to connect it to anything until 3 days ago." He turned. In his hands was a small, worn, leather-bound journal. The cover cracked with age, a faded strip of masking tape on the spine that read. In handwriting she recognized instantly, even after 9 years, N. Marsh Personal. Delaney's breath caught somewhere in her chest. "That's your father's," Whitlock said. "Flight log. Personal notes." It was recovered from his quarters after the incident and filed away as part of the mishap investigation. "Never returned to your family. I don't know if that was oversight or something more deliberate. Given everything we now know about who benefited from your father's death staying quiet, I suspect you can guess which one I believe." She took the journal with hands that weren't entirely steady, opened it. Her father's handwriting filled page after page flight notes, technical observations, the occasional half-finished sketch of an aircraft silhouette in the margins. And near the back, dated only a few weeks before the incident, a single entry that stopped her cold. "Meridian's new pod is being rushed. Told the safety data isn't final, but corporate wants it flying regardless. Raised concerns with program office. Was told to stand down and fly the schedule as briefed." Below it in smaller, more hurried handwriting, as though added later, almost as an afterthought, "If anything happens, someone needs to keep asking why." Delaney read the line 3 times. Someone needs to keep asking why. Her mother had tried, had been silenced for it, one way or another, and had carried that silence to her own grave 5 years later without ever explaining what she knew. And now, 9 years and one impossible dogfight later, her father's own handwriting had finally answered the question he'd never gotten the chance to ask out loud himself. "He knew," she said quietly. "Before it happened. He knew something was wrong." "It looks that way," Whitlock said. "I'm sorry, Captain. I wish I'd found this sooner." "You found it," she said. "That's more than 9 years of silence ever managed." She closed the journal carefully, held it against her chest, the way a person holds something they've been waiting their whole adult life to be handed. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Talon Ridge, for the first time, arguably, since the day of her father's funeral, something in her posture eased. Not fully. Grief didn't work that way, and she knew better than to expect it to. But enough. Enough to breathe differently. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Wardell. With Meridian." Whitlock's expression turned careful. "The Inspector General's office has opened a formal inquiry," he said. "Voss's statement, combined with your father's journal, combined with whatever paper trail the JAG team can build from Meridian's testing records. It's not nothing, Captain. It's the beginning of something that could genuinely end him. But I won't lie to you. Men like Wardell have survived worse storms than this before. It may take years. It may take more people willing to speak than just one frightened mercenary pilot and a 9-year-old journal entry. Then it takes years," Delaney said. "I've already waited 9. I can wait as many more as it takes." Whitlock studied her for a long moment, something like quiet pride settling into the lines of his face. "Your father would be very proud of you, Captain Marsh," he said. "I only wish he'd had the chance to say so himself." Delaney didn't answer that. Didn't trust herself to, not without her voice breaking in a way she wasn't ready to let anyone see. She simply nodded once, tucked the journal carefully under her arm, and walked out into the cooling desert night with a silver patch on her shoulder, and her father's voice, after 9 long years, finally answered. Word of what had happened over the Ashcombe corridor did not stay contained to Talon Ridge for long. It never does. Not really, not when an emergency guard frequency broadcast gets picked up by a dozen listening stations across an entire theater. Not when a mercenary ace with 6 confirmed kills gets forced to eject by a single unnamed pilot, flying alone against impossible odds. Within a week, the story had taken on a life of its own across every squadron ready room within 1,000 miles. Past pilot to pilot, the way these stories always traveled, gaining detail and losing precision with each retelling. Nobody outside Talon Ridge knew her real name. They only knew the call sign, Spectre. The pilot who flew in total silence, who dropped off enemy radar like she'd simply stopped existing, who forced the deadliest mercenary in the region to eject without ever firing a single shot. because she hadn't needed to, because the fight had never really been about killing him at all. Delaney never corrected the stories when she heard fragments of them repeated back to her, secondhand, through pilots visiting from other bases. Never confirmed them either. She simply let the legend exist at whatever distance it needed to exist. The same way she'd let silence exist around her for most of her life, not because she needed the mystery, but because the truth underneath it belonged to her and to her father's memory, and to nobody else who hadn't earned the right to hear it. Some things, she'd learned, were worth protecting quietly. Her father had understood that too, in the end. Someone needs to keep asking why. She intended to. 6 weeks later, on a morning that felt almost absurdly ordinary compared to everything that had come before it, Delaney Marsh stood once again at the edge of the flight line at Talon Ridge, helmet under one arm, preparing for a routine training sortie that had nothing to do with Obsidian Group, nothing to do with Preston Wardell, nothing to do with 9 years of buried grief. Just flying. The thing she'd always loved before any of the rest of it had happened to her. Lund fell into step beside her, coffee in hand as always, grinning in the easy way he'd grinned since the very first week, back when she'd barely acknowledged his existence, and he'd kept trying anyway. Heard the Inspector General's office subpoenaed a whole warehouse of Meridian's testing records yesterday, he said. Whitlock's practically walking on air about it. Good, Delaney said. You don't sound thrilled. I am thrilled, she said, and something in her voice suggested it was even true. In the quiet, contained way she experienced most things. I've just learned not to celebrate a fight until it's actually finished. Fair enough. Lund studied her for a moment, considering. For what it's worth, Spectre's a pretty good call sign. Better than whatever nickname the rest of us were using before. The Ghost. Right. That. He winced slightly. In our defense, nobody knew you yet. They still don't, really. No, Lund agreed, easy, unbothered by the honesty of it. But I figure that's kind of the point of view, Captain. People don't need to know everything about a person to respect what they've watched them do. Delaney considered that. Turned it over the way she turned over most things, slowly, carefully, giving it more weight than the casual delivery probably intended. That's surprisingly perceptive for someone who offers me half a sandwich every single day and has never once succeeded. Lund laughed a real laugh, bright and easy. The first one she'd heard from anyone in weeks that didn't carry the weight of everything they'd all been through. One of these days, he said, you're gonna say yes, and I'm gonna frame the moment. Don't hold your breath, Lieutenant. But there was something almost warm in the way she said it. Something that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago, when she'd stepped off that transport aircraft with a duffel bag over one shoulder and 9 years of silence, sealed up tight behind flat gray-blue eyes. She climbed the ladder to her jet a few minutes later, settled into the cockpit with the same just efficiency she brought to everything, and paused just for a moment, just long enough to feel it with her father's journal sitting safely at home in her quarters, and his voice finally, after 9 years, no longer waiting to be heard. Someone needs to keep asking why, she'd asked. She'd found the answer, or at least the beginning of one. And somewhere out past the horizon, in boardrooms and legal offices that had spent 9 years believing themselves untouchable, the questions were only just starting to arrive. Delaney Marsh pulled her canopy shut, ran through her pre-flight checks with the same silent precision that had once made an entire squadron call her a ghost, and pushed her throttle forward into a sky that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt entirely her own. Above the high desert of Talon Ridge, the wind was calm that morning. Steady. Like it, too, finally understood that the storm had passed, and something quieter, something earned, and hard-won, and long overdue had settled into its place.